How did a small country dare to challenge the communist giant, and in just a few months, inflict irreparable losses on the totalitarian empire? Why were the Red Army soldiers so terrified of Finnish snipers? And how did a professional farmer and hunter, Simo Heiha, become a living legend so hated by the Kremlin's generals? And finally, under what circumstances did the legendary Molotov cocktail appear? Why did it get that name? And who were the first to be treated with this fiery mixture? Friends, welcome. You're watching the Documentalist Project, and today we're talking about the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939. Why did we choose this topic? It's simple. Because there are striking similarities between that war and the one we're facing today. It's the Soviets' promises to conquer Finland in 2 or 3 days, and the way the world refused to believe that a small country could withstand the Bolshevik onslaught, and the cynical propaganda and lies with which Stalin's henchmen justified their actions. In the end, the military campaign against the Finns turned into a nightmare and a disgrace for the Red Army. And this story must also be told, because it's one of those rare cases when David actually destroyed Goliath, and it all began in November. It's going to be interesting. Let's go. In August 1939, the Soviet Union and Germany divided Eastern Europe between themselves. According to the pact signed by Molotov and Ribbentrop, the foreign ministers of both countries, the Allies planned not only to carve up Poland but to go much further. Indeed, under the agreement between the dictators, the Baltic states and Finland were also to fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. Here you can see what that secret additional protocol on dividing spheres of influence looked like. From September 28th to October 10th of that same year, the Soviet Union signed treaties with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, under which these countries allowed Soviet military bases on their territory. In fact, the communist regime occupied them. Next, Stalin made the same kind of offer you can't refuse to Finland. But here, the Kremlin's tyrant faced an unpleasant surprise. Amid World War II, already raging in Europe, the small nation wanted to maintain its neutrality, and Soviet troops on its territory were clearly unnecessary. So Finland refused. For some time, negotiations continued between the two countries, but eventually they reached a dead end, all because Moscow, true to its usual style, was showing excessive appetites. For example, to its previous demands, it added another one, to push the Soviet-Finnish border 90 kilometers away from Leningrad. In the Soviet Union, this move was explained quite simply. They allegedly feared that the Nazis would attack through Finland, and from there it would be just a short step to the USSR. So the Kremlin strategists came up with nothing better than to move the border. We can't do anything about geography, Stalin cynically remarked during the talks. Since Leningrad can't be moved, we'll have to move Finland's territory instead. Naturally, the Finnish diplomats refused. When all arguments were exhausted, the foreign minister stated, "We, the civilians, have achieved no progress. Now it's up to the soldiers." And it's worth adding that the negotiations were just a facade, because all that time, while the talks were ongoing, the USSR was secretly preparing for war. The Soviet press launched a powerful anti-Finnish propaganda campaign. For the upcoming war, they even wrote a special song called "Receive Us, Suomi, Beautiful One." Suomi is what the Finns themselves call their country, and this song in particular contains the following lines. The low autumn sun lights fires on the bayonets. In other words, when the Soviet songwriter was composing his propaganda tune, the war had already been planned for the autumn of 1939. And most likely, no territorial concessions could have postponed the coming bloodshed. After all, what were 90 kilometers of border when the Kremlin wanted the whole country? So the events that followed unfolded rapidly. The Finnish delegation left Moscow, and by November 3rd, the Leningrad military district was placed on full combat alert. On November 29th, the USSR announced it was severing relations with Finland, and the next day, the Red Army began military operations. they didn't start just like that. The invasion was preceded by a provocation. Everything unfolded just like in today's Russian-Ukrainian war. So, the pretext for invasion was staged by a special NKVD unit. Operatives of this repressive agency fired 7 mortar shells at Soviet territory. The Kremlin leadership immediately reported 4 Red Army soldiers killed and 9 wounded. Even though the Finnish military command offered to conduct an investigation, Moscow refused to look into the incident. Instead, it handed the Finnish ambassador a note of protest and declared the severance of diplomatic relations. On November 30th, 1939, commander of the second-rank Kirill Meretskov gave his troops the following order. Fulfilling the sacred duty before the Soviet government and our great people, I order the troops of the Leningrad military district to cross the border, crush the Finnish forces, and secure forever the northwestern frontiers, as well as the city of Leningrad, the cradle of the proletarian revolution. Thus, without declaring war, the Soviet Union hurled a powerful military fist at Finland. 4 armies simultaneously invaded the country along various sections of the border, from the Karelian Isthmus to the Arctic Circle. The advantage over the Finns seemed overwhelming. 425,000 Soviet soldiers versus 250,000 Finnish. 2,876 guns versus 534. 2,289 tanks versus 30. 2,446 aircraft versus 130. You can see the balance of forces on this infographic prepared by the publication Babel, based on Finnish and Soviet archival sources. So, as we can see, the Finns effectively had no armored forces or air power. What's more, that very day the aviation began bombing the Finnish capital, Helsinki. Planes dropped 600 bombs on the city. A fire broke out. More than 90 residents were killed. Here you can see in the photograph destroyed buildings and burning cars after the air raid on the first day of the Winter War. The photographer captured a crying woman who, together with other residents, is descending into a bomb shelter. In other words, it was a lightning attack intended to shock the population. In a similar fashion, Vladimir Putin launched his war against Ukraine in 2022. He started a war, but the Kremlin's henchmen did not get an easy walk. That's because our fighters are giving the orcs a very hard time. Interestingly, the USSR also referred to all its actions not as a war, but as a special operation meant to protect the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. And the Finnish people were labeled Nazis and fascists by communist propaganda. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Here's another quite telling fact. Although Finland was dozens of times smaller than the Soviet Union, with only 3.7 million inhabitants at the time, the world immediately dubbed this war the conflict of David versus Goliath, and they expected it to last only a day or two. It wouldn't hold, they thought.
The Finns put on a good show, wrote Harold Nicholson,
a British diplomat and historian. However, they would lose within a day or two. The plan to crush the enemy in a few days was also made in Moscow. The Soviet leadership, headed by Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov, counted on a swift and easy victory, a minimum of 10 to 12 days, at most by Stalin's 60th birthday, which was to be celebrated on December 21st, 1939. In other words, for the Soviets, it was supposed to be an easy walk. Meanwhile, on December 1st, Moscow radio officially announced the creation of the Finnish Democratic Republic on Soviet territory in the town of Terijoki. The government of this puppet state was formed based on the Communist Party of Finland. At the head of the government, party, and republic, Stalin placed a seasoned Bolshevik, the well-known Red Finn, member of the Comintern executive, Otto Kuusinen. At the time, people joked that the Finnish Democratic Republic had been created in his apartment. Here we can see a photograph of the treaty signing. Standing are Andrei Zhdanov, Kliment Voroshilov, Joseph Stalin, and Kuusinen. On behalf of the USSR, the documents were signed by Vyacheslav Molotov. Needless to say, the Soviet Union immediately recognized this puppet government. The backbone of the republic became the Finnish People's Army, which began forming in the USSR as early as mid-November. And this painfully resembles the creation of the so-called DPR and LPR with their militias. In other words, we can see that their Chekist habits do not change at all. First comes an armed provocation, then troops cross without declaring war. A puppet republic with a pocket government is created, accompanied by cynical lies. For example, when Soviet pilots bombed Helsinki, Vyacheslav Molotov, the contemporary equivalent of Lavrov, responded to international criticism by saying, "These are not bombs. It's humanitarian aid being dropped from the planes." Can you imagine the level of cynicism? But in fact, that very lie gave the name to the famous Molotov cocktail. Later, to stop Soviet armored vehicles, the Finns began mass-producing bottles filled with flammable mixture, and they called them a cocktail for Molotov. The Molotov cocktail, as if to say, "You drop us food from planes, we'll send you a drink to go with it." Friends, we'll continue next with how the events unfolded. But first, our usual reminder, if you like our channel and the content we create, please subscribe and leave a comment. That way, YouTube will know it's interesting and recommend it to other viewers.
Next, we'll tell how the Finns defended their independence.
And how many Ivan soldiers were left forever in the Finnish snow. But first, let's talk about the international reaction to the Soviet invasion. So what did the world leaders do? Remain silent, watch, or condemn it? I must say, the politicians' behavior was exactly the same as during Russia's aggression against our country. Europe and the United States were outraged. The Soviet Union has attacked Finland, wrote William Shirer, head of Radio Berlin, in his diary after hearing the first reports about the bombing of cities. The great champion of the working class, the mighty preacher against fascist aggression, has attacked the most decent and hard-working small democracy in Europe. I raged for 30 hours and couldn't sleep. In addition, of course, there was also military assistance. And who do you think provided the most weapons? That's right, Great Britain. As early as December 4th, the British War Cabinet decided to sell Finland 20 Gloster Gladiator biplane fighters. During the entire war, the British also delivered to the Finns 114 field guns, 200 anti-tank guns, 185,000 artillery shells, 17 air bombs, and 10,000 anti-tank mines. France, Denmark, Belgium, and even fascist Italy at that time also provided help. The United States imposed sanctions and stopped the export of several goods to the Soviet Union. In response, however, the American-Russian Chamber of Commerce compared such a stance to refusing to sell goods to a man simply because he beats his wife. I don't even know how to comment on that. The U.S. embargo remained in place until July 1941. Only when Hitler attacked the USSR and America realized that the mad German dictator had to be somehow contained, did they unblock the accounts of Soviet trade organizations. Moscow once again began to receive everything necessary for the development of its industry, especially its military industry. And now, let's turn to the actual theater of war. I'll say right away, it wasn't possible to capture Finland in a day or 2 or 3, not even in 23. But let's go step by step. So the Finns were attacked by an enormous number of troops, infantry, tanks, artillery. At the same time, the Air Force was dropping bombs. At that time, contrary to Kremlin propaganda, the Finns themselves were not prepared for war. Their army consisted of only 30,000 soldiers and officers. We are at war now ourselves, and we can truly grasp how little that really is. Finland's unreadiness for military conflict had its reasons. For 2 whole decades, starting from the 1920s, this country, like many others in Europe, had placed its faith in the newly created League of Nations and steadily reduced its military spending, hoping for a new system of international security. However, when Soviet troops crossed the border, the entire Finnish population mobilized instantly. It was an unprecedented display of national unity. Even volunteers who supported communist ideas joined the militia. Most soldiers arrived at the front without uniforms. There simply weren't any. But that stopped no one. The Finns heard the call of their commander-in-chief, Gustaf Mannerheim. "We are fighting for our home, our faith, and our fatherland." And they responded without hesitation. Despite the Soviet army's superiority in weapons and number, the Finnish fighters used several of their own advantages, ones that proved devastating to the enemy. For example, they moved on skis and were extremely mobile. They used reindeer, which allowed soldiers to transport machine guns and mortars almost silently through the forests. The Soviet armored columns, on the other hand, could be heard from many kilometers away, and they could only advance along narrow roads cutting through Finnish thickets. So whenever such a tank convoy entered a certain area, the Finns would simply surround it and destroy it, either by gunfire or with Molotov cocktails. Here, you can see completely destroyed vehicles and the frozen bodies of Russian soldiers along the road. From the very start, the Finnish defenders wore white camouflage, which made them invisible in the snow. Soviet troops initially wore dark uniforms, making them easy targets for Finnish snipers. By the way, snipers played one of the decisive roles in this war, and none was more famous than Simo Häyhä, nicknamed the White Death. He killed more than 500 Soviet soldiers and is a national hero of Finland. Interestingly, he always shot with a rifle that didn't even have a scope. Why? Not because he didn't have one. On the contrary, it was a clever trick. An open sight allowed him to aim faster and therefore neutralize the enemy more quickly. Moreover, there were no lenses that could reflect light and reveal his position to the enemy. Simo also developed his own tactics and shooting techniques. For example, he used water to freeze the snow in front of him so it wouldn't scatter when he fired. He also kept snow in his mouth so that his breath wouldn't form visible vapor clouds. Later, he was severely wounded in the head but survived. He lived to see the end of the war and died in 2002 at the age of 96. The brutal cold also worked against the Soviet troops. The Soviet command, expecting a quick campaign, failed to provide its troops with proper winter clothing. As a result, thousands of soldiers in light overcoats froze to death as temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. As a result, Soviet losses were catastrophic. Entire Soviet divisions vanished in the snow of Finland within just a few days. It's worth adding that the so-called Mannerheim Line, a series of fortifications built by Finland on the Karelian Isthmus, played a key role in the Winter War. The Red Army managed neither to break through it from the east nor to bypass it. 2 Soviet divisions and a tank brigade that attempted to bypass the Finnish defenses were encircled and destroyed. Even Mannerheim himself admitted that, due to a lack of funds, the defensive line had been far from perfectly built. There was a defensive line, of course, he said, but its strength came from the resilience and courage of our soldiers, not from the reliability of the fortifications. Later, in an attempt to justify the Red Army's defeats, Soviet propaganda created a myth about the invincibility of this defense network and exaggerated its power and impregnability. The freezing cold and massive losses led to a collapse in the morale of the invaders. They didn't understand what they were fighting for. Reports prepared by Soviet security services about the soldiers' moods at the front contained transcripts of conversations like these. Red Army soldier Karatanov, fighting for the liberation of the Finnish people. We never actually saw them. From the interiors of their homes, it's clear that the Finnish people lived wealthier and better than our collective farmers. Why interfere with their independence? And here's what Red Army soldier Kuritsin said. Why are we liberating the Finns? They're already living well. The soldiers' demoralization was also worsened by the fact that they rarely ever saw a dead Finnish soldier, because the Finns had strict orders to retrieve all their fallen comrades from the battlefield. Meanwhile, Red Army soldiers, trying to survive the brutal cold, were forced to build shelters out of the corpses of their fallen comrades. It came to that. So, realizing that certain death awaited them ahead, many Red Army soldiers saw no other option but to surrender. And here's another interesting fact. Many of our compatriots fought on both sides, in the Soviet army and in the Finnish ranks. For example, among the most well-known Ukrainians who helped the Finns defend their independence from the Bolshevik invasion was a former officer of the Ukrainian People's Republic Army, intelligence agent and writer Yuri Horlis-Horsky, author of the novel The Cold Ravine. Thousands of Ukrainians living under the occupation of the Communist Empire were forced to fight for Stalin. Thus, in the snows of Karelia, the elite 44th Shchors Division perished. It had been stationed in Zhytomyr before the war. It arrived at the Finnish front, equipped with about 150 radio stations, over 500 vehicles, 44 tanks, more than 100 tractors, and 50 motorcycles. But the soldiers received no clothing suitable for the harsh winter conditions. They didn't even have gloves. Felt boots were issued only to commanders and a few selected units. The soldiers had to fight in light overcoats and canvas boots. A veteran of the Finnish campaign, Grigori Herashchenko, recalled that warmer clothing was reserved for commanders, political officers, pilots, and tank crews. They had sheepskin coats, quilted jackets, and felt boots. For infantrymen, such things were considered a great luxury. They claimed that heavy sheepskin coats made it difficult to go on the attack or storm enemy positions. Meanwhile, the night of January 3rd to 4th, 1940, was one of the coldest of the entire Winter War. Temperatures dropped to between 45 and 50 degrees below zero, There are many stories about how the Finns crushed the 44th Division, but the fact remains that by January 8, 1940, the division, numbering 17,500 men, had been completely destroyed. Personnel losses exceeded 70%. Around 1,200 soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. It's worth noting that Ukrainians, more than anyone else, couldn't understand what they were fighting for. One soldier of the division complained, "The Soviet Union says we're fighting to liberate the Finnish people. Tens of thousands of us are fighting. People are dying, and just as many will die again. But why do we need this? There's no bread, no meat, no sugar. Huge lines are forming. Prices keep rising. This is what it's come to. Ukraine is the biggest farming republic, and yet we're sitting here without bread." The ideologue of the OUN Petro Fedun Poltava, author of the well-known propaganda pamphlet, "Who are the Banderites and what are they fighting for?" also served in the Red Army in 1940. He also wrote a short story titled The Flag of Finland. In the story, Red Army soldiers from Ukraine find a national flag on a dead Finnish sniper, and they begin to wonder, what does the flag of Ukraine look like? By the end of December 1939, the Soviet leadership realized that further attempts to advance would only lead to massive losses. A lull settled on the front. The new commander, Seaman Timoshenko, took previous mistakes into account. In January and early February, he focused on gathering updated intelligence, reinforcing and regrouping the troops, training them, and organizing supply lines. The Finnish command understood that despite their successes during the first month of the war, they would not be able to withstand the Soviet Union on their own. Great Britain and France had been supplying weapons to the Finns since December 1939, but the Finnish army lacked sufficient manpower reserves. A little over 10,000 volunteers from Sweden, Norway, and other countries could do little against the Soviet force that had swelled to more than 760,000 troops. By mid-February, Soviet troops finally managed to break through the Mannerheim line. The road to Helsinki lay open. Facing the threat of complete occupation, the Finnish government sued for peace. On the night of March 13th, the peace treaty was signed in Moscow on Soviet terms. Hostilities ceased, and the new peace agreement came into force. Under its terms, Finland lost about 1/10 of its territory. That amounted to roughly 40,000 square kilometers. The border was pushed 150 kilometers away from Leningrad. Finland's second largest city, Viipuri, was ceded to the Soviet Union and renamed Vyborg. About 430,000 Finnish residents from the territories ceded to the Soviet Union were forced to leave their homes and relocate deeper into the country. The stolen lands were annexed by the Soviets to the Karelian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, forming a new Union Republic, the Karelo-Finnish SSR, which lasted until 1956. In 105 days of war, the Soviet forces lost 125,000 men, killed alone. Including the wounded, captured, and frostbitten, total Soviet losses exceeded 350,000 troops. In that bloody war, the Finns lost far fewer, about 25,000, but for such a small nation, it was still a tremendous loss. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev later recalled, "All of us, and above all Stalin, felt that our victory was in fact a defeat by the Finns. It was a dangerous defeat, for it encouraged our enemies and left them convinced that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay." And indeed, it was precisely this fact that prompted Adolf Hitler to attack the Soviet Union. Just a year after the end of the Winter War, Finland decided to join the Nazi invasion of the USSR. And here's another fact that perfectly illustrates the nature of our enemies. Soon after the peace treaty was signed, a large paper and pulp mill remained on the Finnish side of the border. And pulp, of course, was essential for gunpowder production. So, just a week after the peace agreement, Soviet troops simply annexed the town, along with the entire mill. Friends, this was the Documentalist Project. Take care. See you next time.